While traveling in Sri Lanka, I learned an interesting story about a biological weapon that became a delicacy. The island of Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, was at the crossroads of trade routes from India and China, and therefore from ancient times attracted the attention of Europeans and Arabs as a convenient harbor for trade. In the 16th century, the Portuguese landed off the island. They were interested in spice cinnamon. In the Middle Ages, cinnamon was quite expensive in Europe. The Portuguese sought to break the Arabs' monopoly on this spice by harvesting it from cinnamon trees that grew in large numbers in Sri Lanka. The Portuguese also needed another spice grown in Sri Lanka, black pepper. It was even more expensive than cinnamon. In the beginning, the Portuguese acted diplomatically and established factories on the coast of the island. However, the Portuguese failed to trade peacefully. They began a military expansion of the island. The Portuguese captured the harbor of Pola Ambatota and renamed it Colombo in honor of Christopher Columbus. Over the next century and a half, they captured half of Sri Lanka, except for the eastern part of the island and the mountain kingdom of Kandy in the central part. The difficult terrain and the stone resistance of the Lankans allowed them to defend one of their kingdoms. But Sri Lanka and the cinnamon growing on it was not only of interest to the Portuguese. In the 17th century, the Dutch established diplomatic relations with the Kingdom of Kandy. In July 1602, the Dutchman Joris van Spilbergen met with the King of Kandy. They began negotiating an alliance to kick the Portuguese off the island. The famous Admiral Zibald de Wert arrived to continue the negotiations. The parties agreed to fight together against the Portuguese army. For this, Dutch received a monopoly right to buy Kandy cinnamon. Together, the Allied forces fought a long war. One by one, they captured Portuguese fortresses and eventually drove the Portuguese off the island. However, relations between the allies were never easy. Even at the negotiation stage, Dutch Admiral Zibald de Wert insulted King Kandy in a drunken state and was killed. And then, after the victory over the Portuguese, the subjects of Kandy did not want to submit to the Dutch, and the central part of the island remained independent. Then, as the legend says, the Dutch went for a trick. They brought to Sri Lanka a breadfruit tree that had never been seen before. Large edible fruits were growing on it. The Dutch were convinced that because of the hot nature of breadfruit would cause disease and death to the warlike Lankans. The ancient breadfruit tree can still be seen in the Dutch fort of Galle in southern Sri Lanka. This fort is now one of the most famous landmarks of the island, with preserved walls, buildings, and even cannons. The breadfruit tree is located on the wall of the Akersloot bastion. Unfortunately, during my visit to the fort, the Akersloot bastion was closed. I had to climb the wall to see the ancient breadfruit tree. Amazing! I saw that the tree was still bearing fruit despite its old age. But is the breadfruit tree harmful, as the Dutch believed? Actually, breadfruit is harmless and even healthy. It contains vitamins, trace elements, and life-sustaining antioxidants. The flavor of the raw pulp reminded me of a delicious turnip, but without the sharpness and bitterness. However, in the 17th century, locals in Sri Lanka were suspicious of the new fruit. They got wind of the Dutch trickery and believed it. But the nutritious fruits were not to be lost, and the Lankans found, as it seemed to them, a way out. To neutralize the hot nature, they began to mix the fruit of the breadfruit with coconut milk. This is how this delicacy, vegetable curry with breadfruit and coconut, became known all over Sri Lanka. Spicy, but tasty. Continuing my journey, I ended up in the neighboring Maldives. There I noticed that breadfruit is almost always planted next to coconut. Apparently, the Sri Lankan experience has been adopted by other nations over time. Nowadays, the breadfruit, as a perfect companion to the coconut, now grows not only all over Sri Lanka, but also in many tropical parts of the whole world. It is grown in 90 countries. There is a Breadfruit Institute in Hawaii that studies. This institute believes that a wider distribution of breadfruit in tropical countries will help solve world hunger. This is due to the excellent ecological plasticity and undermining of the breadfruit tree, as well as its very high yield, from 100 to 200 large fruits per tree annually. Finally, I wanted to point out that many people of the internet confuse breadfruit and jackfruit. They are actually related trees, but the jackfruit is much larger.